Hi, this is the Moog Subharmonicon. Before I explain what it does, let's hear a bit about what inspired it.
In terms of the things that make sound, the sound sources, a lot of the inspiration of that came from the Trautonium, which is an instrument that explores subharmonic generation. The original version of it had an oscillator and two subharmonic generators, and then you could mix those together and put them into a resonant filter. Its tones were purely sawtooth waves, so that's also what you get in this instrument is sawtooth. So the whole name for the thing, Subharmonicon, it's lifted a little bit from the Rhythmicon, which was a device invented by Leon Theremin. It explored harmonics and the polyrhythms they generate. This is an exploration of subharmonics and the polyrhythms they generate. A long time ago when I first met Bob, I was studying stuff with him, and it came up a couple times. There was one of his other students was like super into Schillinger, and there was this one book, Mathematical Base of the Arts, and he has the whole composition system. Influenced a lot of really interesting composers. George Gershon is one of his students. I've always been fascinated with the idea of like patterns that kind of repeat differently each time, and then they come back around, and that's a thing that you can explore.
Okay, now before we dive in and understand what's special about it, let's look at an overview of what's going on here. This is the oscillator section, mixer, traditional synthy stuff, which means filter cutoff and resonance, a two-stage amp envelope, and a two-stage filter envelope. There's a 32-point patch bay, and all this here is the sequencer. So that's the basic overview. So what is all this subharmonic business? Well, to understand what subharmonics are, let's first understand what harmonics are. This is a sawtooth wave. Right now, its fundamental frequency is at C3, and I can change that. Now, notice that to the right of the fundamental frequency, there are all those little lines. These are harmonics. They are what give the sawtooth wave its character, and they're set apart at multiples of the original frequency. Filtering them out changes the character or timbre of the sound. Each harmonic is actually a completely separate note played at a slightly lower volume, and yet they all live together in harmony, so to speak, supporting the fundamental sound. If we wanted to hear those notes individually, we could use the filter's resonance to single them out and play them one by one. And that's the nice thing about harmonics. They sound good individually alongside the core fundamental sound, as well as together combined. So what are subharmonics? Well, subharmonics are basically divisions of the fundamental frequency. And what the Subharmonicon does is let you take each of the two oscillators, the two core oscillators, and divide its frequency by a number between 1, which is itself, and 15. The result is notes in a harmonic series between the note itself and 4 octaves below it. Let's check it out. So let's bring in VCO1. And since VCO1 subharmonic is set currently to a division of 1 compared to VCO1, it should sound the same. Now let's start listening to the subdivisions. Now check out the harmonics on the sub-oscillator. That's a really neat trick they pulled off here. It's a sawtooth, not a sine or square wave sub-oscillator. Now going 4 octaves down becomes clicks very quickly, so let's take the fundamental frequency of VCO1 and bring it up. The fact that the sub-oscillator is a sawtooth wave means that it can stand out on its own really nicely without the help of the fundamental frequency or the fundamental oscillator. And as the sub-oscillator travels through the notes on its way down 4 octaves, it hits some pretty interesting notes along the way. And what the Subharmonicon does is let you create 2 of these and then go ahead and sequence them or play them live using the knobs, and we'll talk about how to sequence them in a bit. So you now understand subharmonics. Now you get 2 subharmonic generators for each oscillator. Let's look at the second one for VCO1. Same deal. Now, of course, the nice thing is that you can bring them together to play chords. And they all move together. Now, in the Subharmonicon, you get 2 rows of these, so 2 oscillators with 2 sub-oscillators each. Now, I've tuned VCO2 to G, and this is on C. Voila. So those are 2 main oscillators, 4 subharmonic oscillators, which can produce results that are quite harmonically pleasing. So there you have the first major innovation in the Moog Subharmonicon. The second one is the sequencer. Now this is a bit complex, so stay with me. Let's start with the simple part. There are 2 rows. Each row represents 4 steps for each of the oscillators. Now you may say, a 4-step sequencer, give me a break, what can you do with that? But that's where it gets interesting and complex. So let's break it down. Let's just start with 1 row for 1 oscillator and see how this works. I'm going to lower all the sub-oscillators and VCO2 and just leave VCO1. And you can see when I run the sequencer, every step triggers a note. So just look at the top row for now. I'll run the sequence. I can control its tempo. Simple. Now the sequencer can be set either to have no impact on frequency, to impact the sub-oscillator frequency, or the frequency of the main oscillator. Let's check it out. So that's how it impacts frequency. And you can run this through a quantizer if you want to hit specific notes, or if you want to keep it microtonal, just do it like this. And the second option is to have these knobs impact the sub-oscillators. Right, so you can't hear it on the main oscillator. Now, sequencing notes this way is a little bit tricky and takes a little practice, because what you're doing is basically selecting one of the 16 subharmonics as sort of like a bass, and then using the sequencer steps to deviate left and right from that bass. This is where it takes a little practice to get a feel for the instrument and how to control it. And as you feel your way around, you'll find those notes and sequences that sound good together. And if you turn the VCO sub knobs separately, you're really sequencing chords, not notes. So the impact of the subharmonic played into relation of oscillator 1 is a combination of these knobs and these knobs. So pretty simple, right? But here's where it gets complex. You see, what controls how quickly the sequencer triggers, the clock of the sequencer, is not just the tempo, but also the subdivisions that we apply to it. You can see the more I turn this knob, the slower the clock subdivisions are. Anecdotally, these tempo subdivisions are also subharmonic divisions, just at a much slower rate, than what you heard with VCO 1 and 2. So you might say, that's not very interesting. Why would I want to set the tempo with 2 knobs if I can just set it with 1? And that's where the beauty of the sequencer comes in. You can have it affected by more than one subdivision. Right? So this is a steady subdivision. Let's add this one. Now, at this point, hopefully, a light bulb turns on and you begin to realize that what's going on here is really not a 4-step sequencer, but rather 4 separate notes or chords that are played polyrhythmically, sometimes in different order based on the subdivisions. And not only that it's not 4 steps, this can take a while to repeat. And that's the nice thing about the Subharmonicon. Just like these knobs play subharmonics of the core frequency, these are subdivisions of the tempo's frequency. And it goes from 1 subdivision, which is basically the same as the core tempo, all the way to 15 if you turn the knob fully clockwise. And it's the combination of these subdivisions that make the pattern interesting. And you can see why this is way more than a 4-step sequencer. Now, you can mix and match up to 4 of these subdivisions, so things can get pretty crazy. Now, to keep things in check and to give a little bit more flexibility, you can determine which of these subdivisions affects which of the sequencers using these switches. So in this case, I've set sequence 1 to be affected only by subdivisions 1 and 2. If I turn these on, it won't have any impact on sequencer 1, and I've set sequencer 2 to be impacted only by subdivisions 3 and 4, which are these 2. But if I wanted, I could have either sequencer be affected by all 4 of the subdivisions. So let's add oscillator 2. So we have the upper pattern going crazy here. Now let's add sequencer 2 with a normal pattern going here. Right, so you can see this is moving forward at a steady pace, whereas this one is going nuts because it's being impacted by 2 different subdivisions of the tempo. If we bring things back to normal for a second, and I can reset. So for example, if I wanted this pattern to go twice as slow as this pattern, all I'd need to do is turn this knob a little bit. Or if I wanted triplets, I could move it just a little bit more. Now, without any advanced patching, all the oscillators are playing paraphonically, which means they share one amplitude envelope and one filter envelope. These 2 are the last 2 sequencer options. Logic OR means basically any trigger is passed on directly to the sequencer, regardless of whether there's an overlap or not. And XOR applies a variation in case the clocks overlap. Local disables the triggers for the envelopes, but the sequencer will still keep on running. You can then trigger the envelopes externally. So that was the hard stuff. That's basically it. The rest is just to let things happen. For the sake of good order, I'll go over some of the stuff we're used to seeing in other similar synthesizers by Moog, like Mother 32 and DFAM. There's a low-pass filter here with resonance. There's a VCA or amp envelope, which is an attack decay envelope. The attack envelope is a slight improvement on the DFAM, but not quite like the Mother 32. It's not a knob, but rather it has 3 stages. There is a short attack, which is 1 millisecond. And then I think this is 100 milliseconds on medium. And this is a second. And then decay is controlled with this knob, and I think it goes up to 10 seconds. There's also a bipolar 2-stage filter envelope, also with a 3-step attack and controllable decay. So I can play around with it like this, for example. And the 32-point patch bay is quite extensive. As usual, the inverted text represents outputs and the regular text represents inputs. And it's quite lovely. There are outputs for all the oscillators, including the sub-oscillators, and there are inputs to control them, and there's voltage control for each of the subdivisions. And that, in a nutshell, is the Moog Subharmonicon. Now, unfortunately, the only way to currently get it is to get a time machine and participate in the Moogfest 2018 engineering workshop, or maybe someone is selling theirs on eBay. I know I'm not, because this is quite lovely. I don't have any inside information. I do hope Moog will decide to mass produce this because it is, like I said, quite a magical and lovely little instrument. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments section below. If you want one, write your local Moog dealer and tell them you want one. Maybe they'll pressure Moog to produce this. Hit like if you like this video or the Subharmonicon, and click the subscribe button if you want to see more about this and other synthesizers. Thanks very much for watching.
It's got a thing that it does. It's neat. It's fun.